It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Evan Jewell. Let me just make sure I'm got all my ducks in. Who is entitled Notes from the Post-Classics Future, Classics Without Its Core. Evan Jewell is Assistant Professor of History at Rutgers University, Camden. He received his PhD in Classical Studies from Columbia University in 2019. He works on Roman and ancient Mediterranean history and has published on topics ranging from Roman colonization as a form of domestic displacement to the youth of the Emperor Nero. He's currently working on a book, Youth and Power, Acting Your Age in the Roman Empire. He's co-editor with Elena Isayev of Displacement in the Humanities, Manifestos from the Ancient to the Present, special issue of Humanities, as well as a new volume, Mobility and Antiquity, Rethinking the Ancient World Through Movement, which is now under contract with Routledge. He's the 2022-23 Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Rome Prize Fellow in Ancient Studies at the American Academy in Rome. And it's a pleasure now to welcome him to our committee. Take it away.
Thank you, Joe, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to both yourself and Hannah for hosting this wonderful conference. And thank you to all of the other presenters. I've learned so much so far today, and look forward to hearing Kelly's talk after mine. I'm just going to share my screen, if I can get this to work. Yep. Okay. So COVID-19 anticipated and in some cases accelerated shifts in the higher education landscape, which will continue as universities face the challenges posed by smaller enrollment numbers due to a demographic cliff in the size of future cohorts of college-age students. This was first driven by the 2008 financial crisis and the drop in the birth rate then, for specifically cohorts entering college in 2025, so that's around the corner, and yet again with the pandemic for cohorts entering college in 2037. But we don't need to look that far into the future to see that the issue of falling enrollments is already on our doorstep in the humanities specifically, compounded by a pre-existing prioritization of employability in terms of major and degree choice, as well as a broad difficulty in articulating why the study of the humanities still matters. Zooming in further, for the field of classics, existential reckonings, department and program closures, non-renewal of tenure lines, the adjunctification of teaching, and the professoriate in general, are not new, but they are becoming ever more frequent. Just this week, we saw the announcement that in the UK, the University of Roehampton plans to eliminate a number of departments, including classics, along with their entire faculty. Some 226 faculty are on the chopping block. Since the summer of 2020, I've run the Classics at Risk Twitter page and database, tracking any classics departments or programs broadly conceived, which have come under threat and have either been eliminated or saved. At least 10 have been eliminated in that short time. As you can see, the majority of classics departments or programs which have been closed were at small to mid-sized institutions, often liberal arts colleges, usually without large endowments and therefore more susceptible to decreased enrollment pressures. The University of Vermont, a public R1 institution, might seem like a notable exception, and its department has been saved for now, but it should be viewed within a longer history of classics departments being disbanded or merged with other departments, such as modern or world languages. There is a longer history here, which is yet to be told, whereby many universities had already been cutting or merging classics into other departments due to falling enrollments or cuts in government funding. A case in point, one R1 public university I had a campus visit at once for a job. Now, beyond the job market itself, you learn a whole lot about how higher education works by having to speak to every single member of an entirely foreign department in a foreign university for 2 days. Well, in this case, the search committee was made up of a mixture of classicists, but also experts in Chinese literature, gender theory, French eco-criticism, and more. This was because classics had long ago been subsumed into a large department of world literatures and cultures. In this setting, I was told that the pressure from the administration to put butts in seats was huge. And had I gotten the job, they would have wanted me to develop hybrid courses, and this is pre-pandemic, that could fill 200 to 400 seats in person and online, as well as graduate seminars for MA and PhDs who had no training in classics. At the same time, the legislature of their deep red state had to continually cut their budget. Well, they didn't have to do it, they chose to do it, forcing them to expand the number of students they admitted and to raise their tuition dollars. Suffice to say, while they are a great group of people doing good work in that department, I was relieved in some ways not to have gotten the job. Another context where this has frequently happened well before the present crisis is the satellite campus of an R1 public university, whose flagship campus does have a robust classics department, usually anchored in a PhD program, but as a result does not feel the need to offer something considered as niche as classics to a satellite campus that is materially much smaller and which it might consider less important to its mission in certain ways than the flagship. I'll return to that mission again soon. That satellite campus, however, is my own current context here at Rutgers University, Camden. Note the hyphenated name. It is a point of both pride and bitterness among my colleagues, I have learned, that no one here ever just says they are at Rutgers. Now, I have great colleagues and friends in the New Brunswick campus. This is not about them. This is a structural choice deeply entwined with the history of public universities across the USA, which I can't get into today. But I want to use my own example as a way to talk about how classics functions on a campus without a classics department, without any ancient language instruction, and therefore without its supposed disciplinary core. Because I'm not alone, and increasingly more and more classicists might find themselves in this situation. In the same year that I was hired, a friend, Dr. Jane Sansonito, was hired at UMass Lowell, another satellite campus of a public university system without a classics department. On my campus, classics looks a bit like this. First, we have no ancient languages. No Latin and Greek is formally offered. I heard from one librarian with decades-long institutional memory that it used to be taught now and then over the summer. But in short, if it is taught, it's taught through independent studies. In English, in the English department, I have a colleague who is an expert in the reception of Hellenism in English women's literature of the Victorian era, and who teaches now and then a Greek and Roman mythology course. In art history, I have a colleague who is a Renaissance art historian who regularly offers both the Roman and Greek art survey classes. In religion and philosophy, you will find sometimes an adjunct who teaches mythology and maybe early Christianity. In forensic science, you'll find one of my colleagues, a trained classical archaeologist, teaching courses on osteoarchaeology sometimes. Then in my department, history, you have me. I basically have free reign to teach anything I want besides Western Civ 1. More on that course name in a bit. So what I've sketched so far will likely become a much more common setting in which some version of classics persists. This new setting presents challenges, of course, but it also presents opportunities to reach a far broader audience of students who might not otherwise dip their feet into classics, primarily students of color, first-gen students, community college transfers, full-time working students, mature age students, veterans, and many other students deemed non-traditional. Of course, a lot of these are overlapping. Indeed, I recently attended my first in-person commencement ceremony for my graduating students just this past week. The class speaker was a first-gen undocumented student from Honduras who inspired us all, but also recounted so many of the experiences I had heard from my own students in Zoom rooms and office hours over my first 2 years teaching here. Experiences of living on the edge of poverty, homelessness, of not feeling like they belonged in university spaces, of having to work 2 jobs, having to be a family member's full-time carer. At the same time, our commencement speaker was none other than Nicole Hannah-Jones, creator of the 1619 Project, who received an honorary doctorate that evening and spoke powerfully about her experience of belonging in places and spaces where others, usually white people, tell you that you don't or can't belong. Then as a faculty marshal, I looked down the line I had to lead up the stage, including my 16 or so history majors, and then every other line that passed me by, and saw something I had never seen at the elite institutions I had previously worked at, Columbia and Georgetown. Every second person was a person of color, and primarily women of color. Here I saw sashes denoting Black pride, sashes with various flags, even combined flags such as Puerto Rico and Mexico. Only then did I fully grasp what it means to work at a minority serving institution, a designation we had just received, and what the act of graduating means for my students. It's an overused metaphor, but for most of my students, getting to that podium was truly a Sisyphean endeavor. But none of my students will or can graduate with a degree in classics, nor even a concentration in ancient history. There's just me, remember? Does that matter? Is that the end of the world? Today, I want to suggest that it is not, that it both presents unique opportunities for a classicist, broadly defined, who find themselves in a similar situation to mine, but also certain realities that others, especially PhD granting classics departments, should take account of as they seek to diversify the field of classics. As already noted by Rebecca Kennedy in a recent blog post last year, general education classes, that is classes on the ancient world in translation, represent the bulk of many classics departments' enrollments, frequently offsetting the far smaller enrollments in language classes. The supposed threat of gen ed to classics and its languages has been a recursive debate since the 19th century, popping up, for instance, in the late 1940s and 80s in moments of supposed crisis. See, for example, on the slide, part of the conversation about this published in the Classical Journal in 1948. In my context, however, gen ed classes don't offset other classes, and many of my students' exposure to classics through my own classes or those in other departments I noted earlier is always elective or incidental at best. You might have noticed that I said we had 16 history majors graduate this year. 10 years ago, that was more like 50, according to a spreadsheet I saw in a faculty meeting last month. Nevertheless, even in this environment, I found that not being in a classics department has been liberating in terms of pursuing my own curricular and pedagogical agenda, which speaks to and hopefully adapts to the interests and needs of my own students. There's been a lot of unlearning I've had to do since moving from Georgetown to Rutgers Camden. For instance, to return to the Western Civ 1 class I mentioned earlier. This course represents the first and sometimes only encounter a student will have with the history department and the ancient world. Myself, along with my 2 other colleagues who teach the second and third parts of the Western Civ sequence, are fully aware of the deeply problematic name of the course. We have not had to fight a battle over that, as some might at other institutions, but we have decided for now to keep it, as a point of departure and provocation. Indeed, the final question of my students' take-home exam asked them to write a hypothetical letter, essay, inspired by Dominic Mercado, I think he might be here, to the Chancellor, arguing why the course should be retained and whether the name should be changed or not, and why, with reference to sources and objects covered in the class, and also some op-eds we read. Most students have come away agreeing that the course name should be changed, but this only comes after a course that reflects an increasingly less Eurocentric, less white version of Western Civ, white in the sense of trying to make Western Civ become white heritage, and stripped of deterministic narratives and so forth. I quickly found that this was an unexpected approach for my students, right down to the actual content covered. For instance, my students, especially my Black students, were surprised, fascinated, and often fired up by the segments on the Nubian kingdoms and how skin color operated in a variety of ways in ancient Egypt and Greece, for instance, and they wanted more after the first year. So I expanded that coverage in the second iteration. While my Muslim students, a sizable portion of the class, some also being Black, were equally intrigued to find how the Islamic world was the Western world for centuries. Now, although all of this is signaled in the course description, most students don't choose classes that way here. It's simply through advising, the advising office, or the title of the class. Indeed, I'd found that the more conventional the title of a course is, the higher the enrollment. For instance, my Athens, the Golden Age class, the title being a hangover from my predecessor who got his PhD in 1971, enrolled 5 times as many students as my Immigration in the Ancient World class, even though they both had Gen Ed designation and were both pitched at the same level. But this provides surprising opportunities for revelation, excitement, learning, and unlearning to occur in the classroom. For instance, one Black queer student in my standard Roman history survey was so amazed to learn in one segment about how certain texts and objects had directly informed later early modern justifications of slavery in the Americas that they asked to pursue an independent research project on the topic. So even though students might be drawn to the class by what might seem to be its conventional facade or traditional narrative, as I think those of you here will agree, this is still an opportunity to introduce students to an anti-racist decolonial history of the ancient world that they might not know of, and that speaks to them in transformational ways, and more broadly, cultivate an anti-racist classics along the lines recently proposed by Mathura Umachandran in an article in Tapa, and I'll come back to that with the reference. Being in a history department and on my particular type of campus also led me down new and exciting curricular paths I might not have otherwise have pursued. For instance, faced with teaching our one required methodology course for history majors, I decided to focus it around Cleopatra and her reception, particularly in terms of debates over her gender and race. The class drew in not only history majors, but also students from Africana studies, which saw interesting conversations transpire in every class, not least because students came into the class with very different preconceptions about Cleopatra. Some had what I would call Shelley Haley revelations, in reference to Haley's seminal essay on how she came to reevaluate her views on Cleopatra's race and ancestry. And because I was teaching the core history major class, I had access to students who might not otherwise take ancient history, such as the majority would take US history concentrators. And several then continued to take more classes with me. This summer, I'm now working with one of them on a summer project focusing on the gendering of museum labels in US and Turkish contexts, which she got a generous grant for. More recently, I've also become more and more aware of service learning, a huge prong in the mission of my university, usually called engaged civic learning, where classes directly work with groups in the local community. This year, I've been a faculty engaged civic learning fellow with a view to seeing how I could incorporate service learning into a course I had proposed for the Honors College called Slavery and Freedom from Rome to Rutgers. Now, Rutgers has its own history of slavery, as so many campuses are finally recognizing, something I'd become aware of from my time at Georgetown and its GU 272 project. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Kendra Boyd, was a co-editor of the Scarlet and Black Project to tell and publish the university's history of slavery. The course was conceived as a course in comparative histories to highlight the connections, disconnections, and problems of studying two different contexts of slavery and freedom, but also a course that elucidates how classics and the classical world was often used by enslavers in the early modern world to justify their own practice of slavery. Not being an expert in the Black Atlantic or Caribbean world of that period, the plan is to bring in outside experts, including advanced PhD students, hopefully from the main New Brunswick campus where we have a real strength in this, to speak about their own research with honoraria for the non-ancient segments. In terms of the service learning program, we plan on working with the local historical society, which has set up markers to sites of enslavement, which you can see one on the slide here, since Camden and nearby places were used as major ports and auction sites for the trafficking of enslaved people. And the aim is to create a digital walking tour, which might also be used by local residents and schools. We also plan on working with Dr. Boyd's Black Camden Oral History Project, which aims to record the oral histories of slavery and freedom in Camden among its oldest surviving residents. Indeed, since many of my students come from Camden itself, the aim is that they would be recovering the history of their own community, making it all the more meaningful. What I've sketched so far then is just one of many different instantiations of a campus without a classics department or program that nevertheless still teaches classics without its philological core, but rather with a gen ed core. The likelihood of this situation becoming more and more common in both the near and long term suggests that the definition of classics that most PhDs graduate with needs to be rewritten or entirely set aside. For instance, graduate programs need to prepare their students for a wider variety of teaching contexts, including seeking out pedagogical partnerships with local, non-elite or non-PhD granting institutions. From the amount of reading you assign to the types of assignments and content chosen, graduates who teach undergraduates at the top 10 institutions or so as part of their academic labor and training will not encounter many of those types of students at campuses like mine. Gen Ed classes in translation need to be repositioned as the core of classics, even among the elite research universities, something already being recognized by places such as Princeton in terms of not making the languages a requirement for the major. And this also extends to the types of graduate students one recruits. I have accepted the fact that my job is not to send undergraduates to graduate school, but if a student should wish to pursue that, we need more fully funded summer, bridging, and pre-doctoral programs in terms of language training for undergraduates who did not have access to the languages. And again, I'm glad to see that places such as Princeton have embraced this approach in recent years, and hopefully more will continue to do this. Part of this means we need to recognize at a more fundamental level, as my colleague at Columbia, Dr. Johan Claros, once pointed out to me during a pedagogy group we were co-running for our fellow graduate students, that the prescriptive grammar of Latin and Greek is necessarily exclusionary to those who did not grow up with it, even in terms of the grammar of English, but especially so in the classics classroom. Many of my own students find pronouncing and spelling many English words intimidating, let alone Greek ones. In a class this past semester on Athenian history, my students played a reacting to the past role-playing game. Many students struggled to pronounce the names of their own characters or that of their classmates. So we began making nicknames, which really put everyone at ease. I could see that something as unimportant as pronunciation could produce inordinate amounts of anxiety and be really counterproductive to the confidence with the history and texts they were otherwise building through their speech making and gameplay. In the present crisis, doubling down on hardcore philology might seem fine for those at institutions with endowments to spare and students who have taken Latin or Greek through high school or earlier. But for the majority, it is a surefire way to turn away students and further entrench our own status as the ivory tower of the academy, with a perceived or real colonialist mindset of correction masquerading under the banner of rigor. Mind you, classics is not the only discipline that does this. History does too. Instead, our mission may actually be better directed when seen in tandem with or inextricable from others, such as Africana or Black studies, gender studies, environmental studies, and so forth. A decolonial and anti-racist mission is better pursued together and not alone in our disciplinary silos. This starts in graduate education too. I really didn't become aware of my whiteness in the classroom and the world and its specific manifestation in a US context until I took a historiography graduate seminar in the history department at Columbia alongside modern historians. I was the only ancient historian, but it was a mind-blowing experience, not least because that is where I encountered Barbara and Karen Field's book, Racecraft, cited in Mathura Umachandran's article. We had the privilege of an author meets audience class since Barbara Fields teaches at Columbia. But if I hadn't been prodded by one professor to take that class, I would never have encountered that book until years later, most likely. Indeed, this reaching out has extended to my current research too, as I've looked into the genealogy of the term boy for enslaved people from ancient Greece and Rome to the Black Atlantic. My ideas have benefited greatly from searching critique and conversation with my colleague, Dr. Boyd, while a colleague in English and Digital Studies has asked me, along with others, to sign on to an NEH grant proposal that seeks to engage students in the racist underpinnings of a public mural and neoclassical building on our campus. Since he saw me teaching my students about the racial meanings of neoclassical architecture in contemporary America at the end of a semester-long class on classical Greek history. Being the only ancient historian and trained classicist on a small campus has meant that I have likely made these connections faster than those who can recede into the comfortable confines of their classics department, perhaps. But it doesn't have to be that way, and for many, it will not continue to be that way. I hope that these few notes from the post-classics future will stoke new ways of thinking about classics beyond and within the elite institutions where it will always likely continue to exist.